Situated on the periphery of the Kepler chain, nestled amidst neglected trade paths and minor unmapped asteroid fields, lay a continuously active scrapyard. This was a locale where cosmic bodies seemed to expire, where ruined craft and failed aspirations corroded beneath dual suns. Within the core of this technological ossuary, housed in a damaged workshop with a corrugated metal roof pieced together from the remains of former starships, labored Hank McCoy. Hank possessed no air of importance or nobility. His hands were calloused, darkened by long exposure to lubricants and scorched wiring. His equipment was antiquated, his techniques more so, yet his skill was exceptional. Power plants designated for disposal hummed back to life under his attention. Apparatus declared defunct by Starfleet's discovered renewed vitality within the confined, buzzing disarray of his workspace. He made no inquiries about the origin of the debris or why certain components bore the insignias of empires that had vanished before Sol III even charted the constellations. His sole occupation was repair. On that particular night, Hank was submerged deep within the interior of a damaged cryovessel, muttering imprecations while contending with a recalcitrant valve. Showers of sparks descended around him, casting light on the grime-stained walls adorned with surplus components, aged pennants, and a handful of worn images from a life he scarcely recalled. Beyond, a wind-whipped dust storm drifted over the expanse, causing metal panels to vibrate and twisting obsolete antennas into sorrowful wind vanes. He registered no incoming sound, no vessel's whine, no communication query, merely an abrupt, profound silence, a sensation of something immense and primordial siphoning the very air from the space. He became motionless, wrench suspended midair, every nerve-ending alert. Deliberately, Hank pivoted towards the workshop's main entrance, compelled by the awareness of a presence too significant to disregard. There, outlined by the tempest's whirling particles and the unsteady external illumination, stood a being he had only ever encountered in the forgotten recesses of ancient lore. A dragon, certainly, though not the monstrous figures depicted in antique Terran manuscripts. This entity was an extraterrestrial marvel. Her scales gleamed with the residual luminescence of expiring stars, deep purple and silver shades merging fluidly with her movements. Her wings, expansive and marked by hardship, curved protectively around a smaller, more delicate shape held close to her breast. For an extended interval, neither party stirred. The storm raged externally, but within that precarious confrontation, stillness prevailed. The draconic being advanced with a slow, trembling step, her claws tapping against the fissured stone flooring. Hank observed the tremor in her limbs, the dark fluid oozing from injuries along her flank, the frantic intensity with which she clasped her offspring. With immense gentleness, she placed the small form at the entrance. Her voice, when it manifested, was not a bellow but a fractured entreaty, a mental communication within Hank's consciousness, circumventing the need for physical atmosphere and auditory waves. Please preserve his life. The juvenile creature at her feet showed minimal movement. Its respiration was faint, its radiant scales dulled and fractured. Hank knelt reflexively, the ingrained habit of a mechanic to assess and repair overriding the primal urge for apprehension. Observing closely, he could perceive the intricate lattice structure embedded within the juvenile dragon's thorax. A mechanical core pulsed feebly, its indicators flashing with inconsistent malfunction signals. It was not merely an organic entity, it was biological life and mechanical systems interwoven, and the technological component was failing. Hank raised his gaze towards the draconic mother, his mouth parched, his thoughts accelerating. "My profession is mechanics," he stated audibly, his tone coarse. "I repair vessels, propulsion systems, not—" He gestured inadequately towards the young one. The draconic being inclined her head, her exhalation trembling against the gritty surface. "You embody something greater." The utterance resonated on a wave of ancient grief and steadfast optimism, enveloping Hank's spirit. He contemplated his ability to elicit function from discarded metal, the manner in which failing starships seemed to revive under his manipulation. He considered all the derelict items he had reassembled without ever comprehending their significance. Perhaps his entire path had converged upon this moment. Hank dismissed his uncertainties. He pulled the work surface nearer. He activated the overhead illumination, its stark brilliance revealing the fragile shape of the ailing juvenile dragon. His hands operated autonomously, clearing area, collecting implements, settling into a cadence more familiar than respiration. "I will attempt it," he declared, resolute. And in the profound depths of the cosmos, destiny altered course. For a human technician had just undertaken an endeavor none other would venture, and existence would henceforth be irrevocably changed. The juvenile dragon remained inert, its chest plating of fractured biomechanical tissue pulsing feebly under Hank's examination lamps. Hank leaned over him, heart hammering, perspiration tracking down his temple despite the workshop's cool atmosphere. The extraterrestrial youngling's breaths were shallow, each successive one feebler than the preceding. Every exhalation represented a struggle against an unseen force eroding its vitality. Hank dried his hands on a cloth and drew nearer, inspecting the vital core, a luminous node situated within the dragon's breastbone. It was fractured centrally, resembling an ovum dropped upon rock. Minute fissures radiated externally, some exuding opalescent liquid, others emitting sporadic sparks. Organic filaments coiled around the core like creepers constricting a wilting arboreal form. He muttered an expletive quietly. This bore no resemblance to any mechanism he had ever mended. The technology, if such a term applied, was part biological, part constructed. A symbiosis so complex that an error with a tool could be as fatal as inaction. The mother, Lithara, observed him mutely, her respiration slow and strained. Her injuries wept astroluminescence, yet she remained stoic. Her concentration was singular, fixed upon the technician positioned before her ailing offspring. Hank exhaled unsteadily and pushed up his sleeves. He recognized the necessity of stabilizing the vital core prior to undertaking further action. He seized a selection of micro-wrenches and a mobile repair kit, typically utilized for mending fractured coolant conduits. Unconventional surgical intervention on alien technology using Starship implements. The sheer lunacy of the situation nearly elicited laughter, almost. He cautiously inserted a sensor probe into one of the core's fissures, monitoring the energetic flux. The data returned was erratic, exhibiting sharp surges succeeded by cessation. He was required to bridge the fractured pathways without overwhelming the biological substrate. Time was rapidly diminishing. Hank steadied his hands and commenced. He gently positioned 2 micro-wrenches, carefully prying apart the fissured casing sufficiently to introduce a patching filament into the breach. The juvenile dragon exhibited a slight tremor but remained unconscious. Hank bit his lip, stabilizing the instrument, fusing the bypass connection with 3 exact micro-welds. Initial illumination reappeared within the vital core. Merely a brief pulse, barely discernible, yet it sufficed. Bolstered, Hank accelerated his efforts. He mended what was feasible, rerouted what was not, constructing a supporting structure around the injured heart. He lacked the requisite materials for a complete reconstruction, but he could secure a reprieve, sufficient for recuperation, sufficient for optimism. Following what seemed an eternity, Hank affixed the final coupling, withdrew, and observed. Initially, naught occurred. Then a profound, trembling inhalation from the young creature. The indicators within his damaged thorax brightened, stabilizing into a slow, consistent cadence. The dragon's small talon flexed feebly. He had survived. Hank leaned heavily against the work surface, shaking with release from tension. He turned towards Lithara, but she was no longer upright. She was kneeling, her head inclined deeply towards the ground before him, a gesture so primeval and significant its import required no interpretation. An oath, a connection, not of possession, but of respect. "You have reinstated more than mere existence." Her voice resonated through the workshop, imbuing every recess with the gravity of a pledge. "You have made contact with the very core of the cosmos." And as Hank gazed upon the small, breathing form of scales and luminescence, something awakened beyond the cosmic boundaries, something primordial, something observing, and something profoundly captivated by a human technician who accomplished the unattainable. The male dragon, Rylex, slumbered for an entire day, enveloped in a makeshift covering of reclaimed fabrics and emitting a faint glow under Hank's vigilant observation. Hank himself experienced little rest, seated stooped on a stool, idly manipulating the fractured housing of a communications transmitter he wasn't genuinely attempting to mend. His thoughts were preoccupied, revolving around and grappling with the recent events. He was not a medical practitioner. He was not a heroic figure. He was simply an individual possessing the skill to persuade damaged objects back into functionality. Yet by some means, he had mended an entity whose very existence was intertwined with the essence of expiring celestial bodies. Not through medical science, nor mystical arts, but with instruments intended for starship propulsion systems and jury-rigged orbital platforms. The sheer illogic of it grated on him even as a more profound sensation solidified within his being. Something resolute, something dignified. Rylex stirred as twilight approached, his small form twitching beneath the material. Hank drew nearer as the dragon's silvery eyelids gently opened. When the juvenile dragon regarded him, there was no apprehension in those broad, radiant eyes, only curiosity and something further, something that resonated in the space separating them, recognition. "You repaired me," Ry articulated. His voice was a fractured murmur, heavy with fatigue, yet imbued with reverence, as if addressing not a mere human but some inconceivable phenomenon. Hank awkwardly scratched the back of his neck. "I merely stabilized you, young one. You see, you're the one who endured." Rylex slowly shook his head. His small horns caught the final vestiges of fading sunlight, casting elongated shadows against the debris-littered walls. "No one else possessed the capability," he stated plainly. The entrance creaked open behind Hank. Lithara advanced, her gait now less heavy, though her injuries still exuded faint streams of astral light. She knelt beside her offspring, gently stroking his brow with a talon delicate enough to cause a constriction in Hank's throat. "You are beyond your own perception, human," she declared, her gaze laden with an import Hank had yet to comprehend. "The core within my son was not designed for repair. Its configuration is ancient, sealed even from the abilities of our most skilled crafters. It was considered definitive, beyond intervention." Hank emitted a short, sharp sound, wiping dirt from his face with his jacket sleeve. "Evidently that information was not relayed to me." Lithara offered a smile, a peculiar, serious expression. "You interacted with something none other had the courage to approach," she stated, "and now others will perceive its effects." The ground beneath the workshop emitted a faint, disquieting tremor. Hank glanced upward abruptly. "What do you imply by others?" Before she could respond, a low-frequency vibration permeated the atmosphere. A profound resonance, initially distant but drawing nearer, akin to a multitude of engines descending from the celestial sphere. The draconic beings became taut. Hank rose, his heart pounding. In the twilight beyond the open workshop portals, forms began to manifest against the deepening azure. Not starcraft nor humanoids, but creatures, dragons, scores of them. Some colossal, their wingspans encompassing entire urban districts, their scales inscribed with celestial patterns. Others were more diminutive, more agile, their shapes shimmering with ethereal luminescence. They orbited above the scrapyard, casting mobile shadows that seemed to dance and bound over the heaps of discarded material like animate entities. "They have perceived the core's resonance," Lithara murmured, "and they approach to ascertain if the extraordinary event is genuine." Hank instinctively retreated as the initial dragon settled heavily in the yard, dispersing corroded engine components and sending a surge of warm, energized air sweeping through the workshop. This draconic entity was more ancient than Lithara. Its scales were subdued and fissured with antiquity. Its eyes, however, gleamed with acute intellect. It inclined its head, gazing into the open workshop, and it articulated, Human, reveal to us the star-born being you repaired. Hank swallowed with difficulty. He cast a look towards Rylex, who sat up unsteadily on his resting place, alternating his gaze between Hank and the dragons amassing like an impending tempest. They are not present to cause harm, Hank stated, more to himself than to others. They are here because your existence is significant. For by some means, a straightforward act of repair had disentangled connections spanning the galaxy, and entities that had reposed in stillness were now stirring. Dragons now occupied the yard, their scales shimmering in every hue of the fading light, wings folded against metallic mounds, tails wrapping around fractured turbines and corroded vessel frameworks. They arrived in silence, save for the infrequent deep resonance of respiration, a sound akin to the gradual movement of glacial formations. Their eyes, numbering in the hundreds, were fixed upon the small technician's workshop, where a human and a juvenile creature were positioned together beneath a fissured ceiling. Hank had witnessed much during his lifetime, traversing the periphery of settled regions. Nothing had equipped him for this spectacle. He stood stiffly at the border of the work surface, his heart pounding so forcefully he imagined the dragons might perceive it. Rylex sat beside him, diminutive in comparison to the assembled behemoths, but his vital core now pulsed with brilliance, potent, resolute, animate. That luminescence had transformed into a signal fire, an indication that an improbable event had transpired. An aged, draconic female, her horns curved with the substantial burden of ages, advanced from the throng. Her scales possessed a shade of blue so profound they appeared to absorb the diminishing light. Her voice enveloped the workshop like a blend of fine fabric and tempered metal. "Who are you, human, to repair that which even the creators themselves were unable to?" Hank parted his lips, then closed them once more. He gazed at his lubricant-stained hands, at the grime beneath his fingernails, at the utility belt suspended low around his waist. "I am merely a technician," he stated finally, his voice rough. A wave passed through the dragons, a collective exhalation, a displacement of mass, not derision nor disdain, something akin to astonishment. The ancient dragon lowered her massive head, the extremity of her snout brushing the periphery of the workshop floor. "You are not simply anything," she articulated. "You represent what was forfeited. You are that which we neglected to pursue." Behind her, a juvenile crimson-scaled drake advanced with a limp, his flank marked by the characteristic luminescence of a fractured core. His respiration was faint. His eyes conveyed an unspoken supplication. Hank comprehended before any explanation was offered. They were not present for conquest. They were present to implore, to hope. Lithara approached his side, her injured form as stable as rock. "If you possess the capacity to mend one," she stated softly, "you can mend others." Hank surveyed the multitude of dragons, observing the aged and the injured, the unsteady illuminations embedded deep within their thoraxes. These were not monstrous entities. They were survivors of a protracted conflict against time, against deterioration, against the gradual failure of their own vital centers. And now, by some inexplicable turn, they perceived him as a source of illumination in their gloom. "I am uncertain of my capacity," Hank conceded, his voice fracturing. "However, I shall make the attempt." He advanced towards the juvenile crimson drake, towards the fractured core that pulsed weakly beneath its scaled chest. And as he opened his lubricant-stained hands, heart exposed, the dragons inclined their massive heads in silence. Above them, the stars seemed to flicker in affirmation, and across the galaxy, systems yet untouched by conflict and devastation trembled on the precipice of something nascent, something originating not from might but from restoration. The atmosphere within the workshop grew dense, becoming something both electric and solemn. The dragons repositioned themselves, coiling more closely around the fractured artifacts of the scrapyard, their immense forms pressing against the boundaries of the light emanating from Hank's damaged workbench. Silence held sway, interrupted only by the faint resonance of Rylex's mended core and the gentle metallic sound of Hank sifting through his aged implements with trembling hands. Before him lay the crimson juvenile, whose vital core flickered like a flame contending with a breeze. This individual was in a more precarious state than Rylex had been. The fissures extended deeper, and ancient cicatrices puckered the organic tissues enveloping the mechanical heart. Whatever conflict the Drake had endured, it had left him on the verge of collapse. Hank exhaled deliberately and wiped perspiration from his forehead with the back of his arm. The aged, draconic female who had initially addressed him, Mellorin, stood nearby, her large eyes weighted with the burden of centuries and a myriad of unvoiced anxieties. "You are not obligated to undertake this labor," she rumbled, her voice low and profound as geological shifts. "You are indebted to us in no way." Hank observed the juvenile creature's shallow respiration. He thought of Rylex, of how vitality had returned to his small form with nothing more than persistent determination and hands prepared to attempt. He contemplated the damaged vessels he had recovered, each one a faint echo of an ambition someone had dared to construct, and how he had reassembled them not for financial gain, but because an internal impulse refused to permit the damage to remain so. He firmed his grasp on the micro-welder. "I am obligated to him," Hank stated plainly. A low sound permeated the assembly of dragons. Not verbal communication, but a collective alteration of respiration and energy, an ancient form of recognition, the type of pledge that required no ritual to be binding. Hank inclined over the juvenile dragon's vital core, scanning the damage, tracing the ruptures with the precision of a surgeon. He could now perceive that the apparatus was not merely malfunctioning, it had been interfered with, deliberately undermined from within. His gut clenched as he identified scorch marks resulting from focused, pulsed energy. Someone had intended for this youngling to perish. He looked up at Mellorin. "Your lineage did not construct this core." "No," she affirmed, her voice subdued. "It was bestowed upon us long past by a different species, a species that no longer exists among the living." Then why was it sabotaged? The ancient dragon offered no verbal response, but the clenching of her jaw and the subtle movement of her immense tail communicated volumes. There were aspects Hank was not yet being informed about, concealments too vast for a solitary technician to bear. But the youngling gasped, a soft sound escaping his fissured lips, and for the present that provided all the necessary response for Hank. He commenced his task. He detached the fractured energy couplings with the delicacy of someone disarming an explosive device. He manually reconfigured the core's memory lattice, bypassing corrupted routes with fine threads extruded from the workshop's emergency fusing unit, a technique he had previously employed to reactivate a failing freighter's artificial intelligence during a pirate assault. Each action was a risk. Every fusion point could either preserve the youngling or extinguish his life. Hours elapsed imperceptibly, the workshop's antique timepiece marking the passage into obscurity. Externally, the dragons maintained their vigil with a patience that had surpassed the lifespan of empires. None spoke, none shifted. And when Hank finally sealed the ultimate rupture and witnessed the crimson core surge with an abrupt, vivid light, when the youngling's respiration deepened and vitality returned to his scales, the collective exhalation from the assembled dragons resembled the slow, respectful sigh of a woodland receiving the initial spring precipitation. The juvenile drake blinked upward at Hank, animate, intact, rescued. Hank collapsed back onto the floor, immeasurably fatigued, and smiled. And in that instant, something more significant than thankfulness pervaded the yard. Hope. Genuine, fervent optimism. The restoration of the crimson juvenile, whose designation was disclosed as Zan, marked merely the commencement. In the subsequent days, dragons arrived from more distant areas of the sector. Damaged, expiring, cores faltering, they bore with them the scarred remnants of generations, each carrying injuries more profound than superficial tissue. And Hank, without respite, without hesitation, continued his labor. He transformed half of his workspace into what could only be characterized as a restorative forge, a location where vital cores and spirits were repaired concurrently. He fabricated bespoke stabilizers from reclaimed metallic alloys. He rethreaded energy conduits utilizing methods previously confined to salvaging archaic jump drives. He absorbed the dragon's narratives while his hands were occupied, learning how their kind had formerly been preeminent navigators of the stars, how they had lost that skill when their vital cores commenced deteriorating centuries prior. It was no longer solely mechanical labor, it was restoration, it was redemption. Yet the galaxy, as is its nature, observed, and certain entities were displeased by their observations. The initial signal arrived 2 nights subsequent to Zan's recovery. Hank was mending the wing articulation of a juvenile sapphire-scaled dragon designated Valaya when the workshop's communication display activated erratically, emitting a high-priority transmission with a sibilant sound. The countenance that materialized was humanoid, yet angular and devoid of warmth, clad in the sharp uniform of the Varaxian Authority, one of the galaxy's most ancient and clandestine power blocks. Their emblem, a hand clutching an ignited star, glowed behind the individual's shoulder. "Human," the Varaxian envoy stated, its voice carrying a metallic edge. "You are in violation of the Progenitor Secrecy Accord. Cease all unauthorized core manipulations immediately. Failure to comply will result in termination." Hank gazed at the display panel, then he severed its connection. The dragons rumbled, a low, profound sound. They grasped the situation. The Varaxians had been the ones who bestowed the vital cores ages ago. They had woven in fragility, dependence, and control, binding the dragons to survival systems they couldn't mend themselves. Silently, imperceptibly, they had transformed the most ancient of species into captives within their own forms. And now a human mechanic had shattered that dominion. Hank turned back towards Valaya, his voice steady. "Let them come." Behind him, the restored dragons, Rylix, Xeon, and others unfurled their wings. Their cores pulsed with a novel radiance, a brighter luminescence, a light of liberty. The tempest was approaching, but this time it would not find a broken populace waiting in the shadows. It would encounter a surging tide. A mechanic and his dragons prepared. The assault commenced just prior to dawn, when the salvage yard was steeped in the tranquil hush of twilight and the stars still dotted the sky like ancient scars. Hank had succumbed to sleep against the side of the workshop, a spanner still gripped in his hand when the initial missile shrieked through the atmosphere. It struck the perimeter barrier, vaporizing it in a burst of searing blue energy, sending molten metal fragments hurtling through the air. Hank jolted awake as the earth quaked beneath him, his heart pounding before his mind fully registered what was happening. Dragons roared from their resting places amidst the heaps of refuse, their wings snapping open like claps of thunder. Above them, Varaxian assault skiffs descended from the clouds, sleek and dark, their undersides bristling with containment grids and null screamers, devices engineered to scramble core signatures and incapacitate any dragon ensnared within their mesh. Hank did not await instructions. He scrambled upright, seizing the emergency control console hastily linked to the yard's antiquated defenses. They were archaic, barely functional, but with a touch of makeshift ingenuity, they would have to suffice. He slammed his hand onto the ignition switch. The old pulse cannons, salvaged from derelict warships and affixed to the junk walls, coughed once, then roared to life, unleashing beams of golden energy into the descending Varaxian craft. One skiff spun out of control, plummeting into a mound of ruptured reactors with a deafening explosion. Dragons ascended into the air, dozens of them, their newly mended cores blazing so intensely the sky appeared to ignite. Rylix flew in tight spirals, weaving between skiffs with a velocity the Varaxians clearly hadn't foreseen. Zebran, heavier but devastating in his charge, collided with one vessel like a comet, tearing through its hull with sheer might. Nonetheless, the Varaxians pressed onward. They deployed containment nets, strands of frigid energy unfurling across the sky, attempting to ensnare and stifle the dragons mid-flight. One of the nets ensnared Valaya, wrapping around her like shackles, her core flickering precariously. She cried out, her wings collapsing. Hank didn't pause to deliberate. He snatched the prototype disruptor he'd assembled from salvaged components and sprinted across the open expanse, sliding beneath the swooping shadow of a skiff, aiming the jury-rigged apparatus at the net anchoring Valia to the ground. He discharged the weapon. The disruptor emitted a cone of magnetic interference so potent it rent the net asunder in a cascade of sparks. Valaya dropped heavily, but she was unbound and alive. The dragons witnessed this. They reacted. They didn't merely fight harder, they fought with greater intelligence. Coordinated attacks, swift dives, breath assaults directed precisely at skiff engines, not haphazardly at their armored flanks. They moved as if sharing a single consciousness. The Varaxians were unprepared for dragons capable of thought beyond mere survival. They were certainly unprepared for a human leading them. When the final skiff retreated, limping towards orbit, it left behind a battlefield not of casualties but of defiance. The dragons descended, battered and bloodied, yet victorious. Hank leaned against the charred remnants of a containment grid, panting, feeling the adrenaline recede from his system. He looked up at the dragons who gathered around him. They did not speak. They bowed one by one. A mechanic, a man of lubricant and grit with stubborn hands, had become something more in their estimation, not solely a rescuer, but a leader. And the galaxy would become aware of it. Ready or not, tidings traveled swifter than any starship. By the time the second Varaxian fleet mobilized for a full-scale assault, half the outlying colonies had heard of the mechanic who defied mortality, who restored the dragon's history had forsaken. To some, Hank became a symbol of perilous insurgency, to others a beacon of improbable hope. It was not only dragons who arrived now. Other species, once subjugated by the silent grasp of the Varaxians, arrived in battered ships and ancient transports, bringing their broken, their injured, their forgotten. They sought healing not merely of body, but of spirit. Hank's junkyard transformed overnight into a living fortress. Makeshift medical bays were carved from the interiors of crashed freighters. The forge expanded, now blazing day and night. Dragons not yet robust enough for combat took shifts hauling scrap metal, constructing defensive walls, installing shield generators fashioned from salvaged technology. They collaborated. They endured hardship together. They evolved. And at the heart of it all stood Hank, grease-stained and sleepless, as resolute as ever. He did not solicit followers, he did not seek legend, but it found him nonetheless. The Varaxians observed the spreading conflagration and panicked. Their second fleet was thrice the size of the first, featuring dreadnoughts bristling with nullifier cannons and squadrons of elite hunters specifically trained to dismantle dragonkind. They arrived not to capture, but to annihilate. Hank stood atop a salvaged gun tower as the dark shapes of the fleet filled the upper sky like a decaying tide. Beside him stood Rylak, now fully grown into a magnificent dragon whose core blazed with a light fierce enough to leave residual images. "This will not resemble the previous encounter," Rylak stated, his voice deeper, more mature. Hank nodded. "I am aware." "Are you prepared?" the dragon inquired. Hank offered a weary smile, twirling a spanner in one hand like a gunfighter poised to draw. "I didn't repair all of you just to witness you being broken again." The initial volleys lanced down from orbit, beams of energy intended to cleave the ground into molten slag. The newly erected shields flared to life, absorbing the initial barrage. Dragons surged into the sky, ascending into the fray like shooting stars made manifest. Hank looked upward, shielding his eyes, and realized something peculiar. He wasn't afraid. He was incensed. Furious that something so magnificent had been compelled to conceal itself for so long. Furious that power had been wielded not to safeguard, but to confine. He slammed his hand onto the comm panel wired into the side of the tower. "All wings, all units," he growled. "Deliver them a message." "What message?" Rylak asked, his wings tensing, core flaring. Hank grinned, baring his teeth. "Inform them the galaxy belongs to those who mend what is broken." And with a roar that cleaved the sky open, the dragons responded. The conflict that erupted above Hank's battered junkyard would be recounted across star systems, not by the commanders who authored historical records, but by the common individuals who whispered about it in the back rooms of stations and beneath the low roofs of forgotten colonies. It was not a clash of polished armies and gleaming armadas. It was survival, tenacious and raw, sung in the roar of dragons and the defiant beat of a human heart. The Varaxian dreadnoughts advanced first, casting lances of nullifier beams down towards the surface, each one capable of extinguishing a dragon's core mid-flight. Massive cannons unfolded like metallic blossoms, spewing devastation. Yet for every shot fired, the dragons retaliated, not with blind fury, but with strategy born from suffering. Reislich led the primary aerial assault, spiraling through the beams with impossible speed, his movements so sharp they tore gaps in the precision of the Varaxian formations. Behind him flew Zevran and Valya, their new cores burning brightly enough to distort the targeting arrays of the enemy vessels. They plunged through the dark mass of the fleet like living javelins, slashing at engines, disabling weapon systems, igniting pandemonium where order had previously reigned. Hank stood at the command center of the ground defenses, barking orders into the crackling old comm unit linked to every last piece of salvaged technology they had pieced together. He directed anti-air batteries assembled from ancient artillery, coordinated flanking maneuvers by swift, agile dragons who had learned under his quiet, persistent discipline. He was not a general, he was a mechanic, and because of that he thought like a constructor, not a destroyer. He perceived the weak points, the overlooked vulnerabilities, the minuscule fissures that would shatter something colossal when struck precisely. As the battle extended into the dead of night, Hank spotted the keystone, the Dominion relay. A vessel concealed at the core of the fleet formation, smaller than the others but pulsating with faint transmissions. A control ship, likely orchestrating the nullifier beams and the slave drone squadrons that buzzed like enraged hornets across the battlefield. "That one!" Hank snarled into the comms, pointing upwards at the tiny flickering signal. "We dismantle that. We dismantle them," Relich acknowledged with a growl through the comlink. Without hesitation, he gathered a flight of 6 of the most formidable dragons and shot into the heart of the blackened sky. The Varaxians perceived the maneuver too late. Rylix and his kin crashed into the relay ship with force and fire, tearing into the hull with talons and breath that carried the wrath of centuries. Bound in silence, the relay buckled, its systems sparking and flickering, its command nodes winking out one by one. And when the relay fell, so too did the coordination of the Varaxian fleet. Suddenly, the dreadnought's precise fire became erratic. The slave drones spiraled helplessly, colliding with one another. The perfect dark cloud of domination unraveled into a flailing chaos of broken wings and fire. The dragons pressed their advantage with a fury that had awaited generations to be unleashed. And below them, standing firm on a patch of earth that had once been nothing but refuse and forgotten aspirations, Hank McCoy watched the tide turn. He did not cheer. He simply clenched his hands into fists and whispered, "Hold fast." And they did. They endured, and they triumphed. The sun ascended, blood red and gold over the debris, casting long shadows across the ravaged battlefield. Smoke drifted languidly into the sky where the stars still blinked faintly through the thinning mists of conflict. Fragments of Varaxian metal gleamed like broken teeth scattered across the battered salvage yard. Here and there, dragons patrolled, dragging downed engines into salvage piles, collaborating with the human settlers who had fought alongside them. The dragons that survived bore new scars, but also a new light in their cores, brighter, fiercer, unbound. And in the center of it all, Hank stood with Rylix perched beside him, their shoulders brushing in silent solidarity. Hank's jacket was scorched through at the sleeve, his hands wrapped in fresh bandages, but his posture was resolute. "You accomplished it," Rylix stated, his voice resonant and deep. "No," Hank corrected, squinting up at the rising sun. "We accomplished it." The elder dragons, Maloran among them, assembled as the sun crested the horizon. Without ceremony, without the grandeur of ancient rites, they bowed their heads once more before the human mechanic. Not because they were bound by obligation, but because they were bound by something far greater: respect, trust, kinship. You have undone a silence that endured beyond reckoning, Maloran said, her voice carrying like thunder softened. You have rekindled the fires of our race. You have mended what the very stars believed broken beyond repair. Hank shifted awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. I merely fixed what required fixing. You restored us to ourselves, Millerin stated, and in doing so you have altered the trajectory of the galaxy. Around them, dragons of all sizes gathered in a wide circle. Some who had only known despair now held their heads high. Younglings like Xian and Valia perched proudly on the spines of larger kin. Relic's wings flared out, the light of his core casting long, triumphant rays above. In the clearing skies, the remnants of the destroyed fleet drifted like a new constellation, jagged, broken, yet beautiful in their own way, a testament to what had been endured and overcome. The salvage yard was no longer a graveyard. It had become hallowed ground. A place where the broken were not discarded, a place where miracles were forged with grease, grit, and a heart that refused to yield. Hank surveyed it all, the dragons, the settlers, the reborn land, and felt something anchored deep within him. He was no longer merely a mechanic. He was a builder of legends, a mender of spirits, and as the first of the new dragons soared into the brightening sky, their scales flashing against the dawn, Hank McCoy, the mechanic who fixed the unfixable, knew one truth with fierce, unbreakable certainty. The stars would never forget them now, nor would the galaxies that followed.